Cool. I'll take care of that far enough. May not happen like today because I'm going to be grading tests and doing a bunch of other stuff today, but probably by the end of the week. All right, folks. Well, let's get started because it is time for class. So I've uploaded a new PowerPoint for you into the Canvas PowerPoint folder. Okay, so if you go into Files on Canvas, the Lecture PowerPoints folder, there's going to be a new one in there called Imperial China. And that's what we're looking at today. We're actually going to spend a little bit of time looking at China today, talking about what's going on in China during the same time that, our last two units have more or less been across about the same span. Talking about from about 1900 to about 1930 or so, 1935. Okay? We're going back, and we're going to cover that same time span where we talked about what was going on with Europe during that time, World War I, Russian Revolution, those kinds of things. We're going to go back and we're going to refocus our camera now on Asia, particularly China, because the correlation between this section and the last unit that we just covered is that we are headed towards World War II. And in order to understand the role that Asia plays in World War II, we have to kind of understand certain developments that go on connected to the spread of communism and how China becomes communist shortly after Russia. Not right away. It takes about a decade or two. But we're basically going to be today looking at China. And it's not the first time in our class that we've talked about China. You guys might remember last semester during our imperialism unit, we talked about how China went through a very long period of time during the 1800s where they were under serious foreign influence. Now, as I mentioned to you at that time, and I'll say again now, they never formally became a colony of anyone. China was never formally turned into a colony, but China's trade for nearly a full century was dominated by foreign powers, in particular Britain, Germany, and a handful of others. And you might even remember we talked about the Opium Wars, where one of the things that Britain was trading in China was opium. And this resulted in two different opium wars being fought, both of them Britain winning those wars, and then Britain took Hong Kong and made Hong Kong a British principality for up until I was in about 7th or 8th grade, about 1998 or somewhere in that area. And so what we're now talking about, we also talked about a couple of rebellions that had taken place. For example, we talked about the Boxer Rebellion that happened in China and the Taiping Rebellion that happened even before the Boxer Rebellion did. And these rebellions were happening because the emperor of China, the Qing emperor is what it's spelled Qing, but it's pronounced Qing emperor. And the Qing emperor was kind of pretty much in cahoots with, on the same side as the British. And the people of China were becoming frustrated because, the situation for China's trade and development was really bad because they were at such a severe disadvantage. And people were upset about the opium addictions and things like that. And so anyhow, All right, so I'm going to switch over to this PowerPoint now, and we're going to get started with the formal lecture, but we are going to be talking about China today. So here we go. Let's start up here. Let me fix my screen. Okay. So, Imperial China collapses. In case you're wondering, this correlates to chapter 14 of your book. And we're talking about the early 1900s here. And basically, just to set the stage for you, okay, just to set the stage for you, in the early 1900s, China was really ripe for revolution. They had faced years of humiliation at the hands of outsiders. Foreign countries were controlling its trade and its economic resources. And many Chinese people believed that modernization and nationalism were the keys for survival. Okay? They wanted to build up the army. They wanted to build up the navy. They wanted to construct modern factories. They want to reform the education system. Yet, on the other hand, you had other people who were in power in China who feared change. And they believed that the greatest part about China was that their traditional ways, the Chinese tradition and the Qing emperor and so on and so forth. So one of the groups that is pushing for modernization and nationalism is going to be what's known as the Kuomintang, okay, the Kuomintang. And the Kuomintang is the official name of the Chinese Nationalist Party, okay, Nationalist Party. Because they are nationalists, they are going to be ushering in feelings of pride about the Chinese people, okay? And when we think about what nationalism is, it's having pride in your nation. It's having pride in your country, right? The Nationalist Party, though, although they want modernization, they want a more industrial, liberal sort of China, okay? And the deal with that is that they are going to come into conflict with people who are more radical than they are in the Chinese Communist Party. But anyhow, the Kuomintang is the Nationalist Party. It's just very important that you make that association in your head. You need to associate Kuomintang with Nationalist Party, okay, of China. Now, the first great leader of the Kuomintang was a guy named Sun Yishan. And Sun Yishan was this believer in the idea that China should reform its military, reform its economy, build new factories, things like that. And in 1911, the Revolutionary Alliance, which was a kind of a precursor to the Kuomintang, succeeded in overthrowing the last emperor of the Qing dynasty. Now, just to let you know, the Qing dynasty had been in power for several hundred years by this point, going back to the 1600s. So very similar kind of thing to what's going on in Europe at this time is that a lot of these old school dynastical leaders like the Austrian king and the Russian Tsar and the German Kaiser and all of these kinds of people, these old dynasties after World War I are collapsing, and it's happening in China as well. but it's kind of a shaky start, okay, for the new Kuomintang. In 1912, Sun Yat-sen had become the new president of the Republic of China, and soon hoped to establish rather a modern government that was based on basically three principles. And here's Sun Yat-sen here, okay. So the three principles of the people is what Sun Yat-sen wanted to use as a measure of the direction that he wanted to take China. So let's talk about the three principles of the people that the Nationalist Party under Sun Yat-sen wanted to achieve. So the first one, nationalism, okay? They want an end to foreign control. They want to push the foreign economic influencers out of China and have the Chinese people retake control of China and its trade. Okay, so that's one. The second principle was people's rights, democracy. Okay, he wanted to institute a democratic republic in China. And then three, the people's livelihood. In other words, economic security for all Chinese people. Sun Yat-sen, we must say, considered nationalism absolutely vital to the future of China. He was once quoted as saying, "The Chinese people do not have national spirit. Therefore, even though we have 400 million people gathered together in one China, in reality, they are just a heap of loose sand." And, you know, the reason that he said this is because, you know, unlike Britain, let's take by comparison, Britain's small, it's an island, it has a growing population at that time, but going back hundreds of years, British people very much identified culturally as British, okay? There was, early on, there was the beginnings of a development of a national identity. This is not really the case in China. China is a huge, vast territory. It's a massive country. It's not as large as, let's say, Russia in terms of territory, but it's not small either. It's a very, very large country, and beyond that, it had always had a tremendous amount of people. And I need to emphasize, I want you to consider this for just a second. You know, today, the United States has 320 million people for its population, something like that. 320 million people. Now, here in the United States, we're a little bit different because we're a multi-ethnic society, but we all more or less kind of at the end of the day identify as American, all right? But even still, with that many people, I don't have to tell you guys about all the divisiveness in America, right? There's a lot of people who have a lot of different points of view, and some of them are very radical, and others of them are very conservative, and so on and so forth, okay? But in China, because of the fact that China had 400 million people, which is more people than the United States has today, and they had 400 million people a century and a half ago, okay? China had a population larger than the modern United States over a century ago, okay? And that too is another factor in why Sun Yat-sen basically said, you know, the Chinese people aren't really, you know, don't have a national spirit. There's so many people there. They lived so far apart from one another. It was really difficult to get people from all of these different provinces around China to conceive of themselves as being part of the same national group. So nationalism in China is a relatively new development, having national pride in in the state of China is really only about a century and a half old. Now, despite his lasting influence as a revolutionary leader, Sun Yat-sen was really seen to be unfit, okay, as a national leader. He lacked the authority and military support that he would have needed to secure national unity. So, what he does is he turns the presidency over to a powerful general of the Chinese military named Yuan Shikai, okay, Yuan Shikai. And his actions ended up sparking local revolts. And Yuan Shikai died in 1916, and civil war broke out shortly thereafter in China. So now China is in the midst of a civil war by 1916. All of the real authority of the government at that time fell into the hands of these provincial warlords across China or powerful military leaders, and they basically just ruled territories as large as their armies could conquer. So China, it's a shaky start down the road of nationalism for China. Civil war breaks out, chaos reigns, and World War I, meanwhile, is being fought just a short distance away over in Europe. So in 1917, the government in Beijing, hoping for an Allied victory because China to this point had more or less stayed out of the war, World War I that is, and so they were hoping for an Allied victory amongst the U.S., Britain, and France. And so China declares war against Germany in 1917. And some leaders mistakenly believed that for China's participation, the thankful allies would return control of various Chinese territories that had previously belonged to Germany. Remember that Germany was one of the powers that had been influencing China and had taken control of some of their coastal ports and stuff in kind of northeastern China. And China was thinking, well, if we join up in World War I on the side of the Allies against Germany, maybe the Allies will give us those territories back when they win the war. However, under the Treaty of Versailles, they basically end up giving the territories over to Japan. And so this whole plan to enter on the side of the Allies and declare war against Germany really kind of backfired. And those territories that they were hoping to win back, they end up losing, now not to Germany, but to Japan. And so when the news of the Treaty of Versailles reached China, outrage swept the country. And on May 4th, 1919, over 3,000 angry students gathered in the center of Beijing. And they started protesting, all right? These demonstrations ended up spreading to other cities and exploded into what became a complete national movement called the May 4th movement, okay? And workers, shopkeepers, professionals end up joining the cause. Now, it's not technically an official revolution, but these demonstrations definitely showed the Chinese people's commitment to the goal of establishing a strong, modern nation. And Sun Yat-sen, leader of the Kuomintang, and other members of the Kuomintang also shared the aims of the movement. But they could not strengthen central rule of China on their own. Many young intellectuals, Chinese intellectuals, turned against Sun Yat-sen's belief in Western democracy in favor of Vladimir Lenin's brand of Soviet communism. And so pretty much after the May 4th movement, we are going to see a real struggle take place between the Chinese Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang, okay, and rather the Chinese Communist Party. So people start turning away from Sun Yat-sen's beliefs and favoring Vladimir Lenin's political beliefs in communism. And of course, because Russia borders China to the north, basically communism is not far away. Communism is pretty close to China already, because by this point in 1919, Russia has already been taken over by the communists, by the Bolsheviks. So, let's talk about how does the Chinese Communist Party start? Well, in 1921, a group met in Shanghai to organize the Chinese Communist Party, and the leader of the Chinese Communist Party is Mao Zedong, and he is, at the time, an assistant librarian at Beijing University and was among one of its founders of the Communist Party. And he would later become China's greatest revolutionary leader. Mao Zedong had already begun to develop his own brand of communism. Lenin had based his Marxist revolution on, his political organization in Russia's cities, but Mao envisioned a different kind of setting for communism. He believed that he could bring a communist revolution to a rural country where the peasants could be the true revolutionaries. Remember that in Russia, really it was the working peoples, the soldiers and people like that, living in urban centers, particularly St. Petersburg, that Vladimir Lenin used to gain power. But Mao Zedong is going to try to tap into the massive rural population of China who are living in the countryside, and they are farmers, right? They're not urban workers. Okay, so this is a quote from Mao Zedong. He said, "The force of the peasantry is like that of the raging winds and driving rain. It is rapidly increasing in violence. No force can stand in its way. The peasantry will tear apart all nets which bind it and hasten along the road to liberation. They will bury beneath them all forces of imperialism, militarism, corrupt officials, village bosses, and evil gentry, or in other words, evil landowners." Okay, so Mao Zedong is going to really be trying to use the rural populations of China to run his communist revolution. And here are some images there of Mao Zedong when he was younger. Okay, so Lenin ends up helping out the nationalist government in China. Okay, while the Chinese Communist Party was forming, Sun Yat-sen and his nationalist party, the Kuomintang, set up a government in South China. Now, like the communists, Sun Yat-sen became disillusioned with the Western democracies that refused to support his struggling government. And Sun Yat-sen decided to ally the Kuomintang with the newly formed Communist Party. And he hoped to unite all the revolutionary groups for common action in China. So in the early days, believe it or not, actually, Sun Yat-sen actually tries to befriend the communists because they both find themselves disillusioned with the West and Western democracies. So Vladimir Lenin seized this opportunity to help China's nationalist government. And in 1923, Vladimir Lenin sent military advisors and equipment to the Kuomintang, the nationalists, in return for allowing the Chinese communists to join the Kuomintang. Okay, so it's pretty interesting that they're trying in these early days here to work together. However, after Sun Yat-sen dies in 1925, a new leader, okay, by the name of, and you may hear different names, okay, but he used to be known when I was young and learning this when I was in high school. They used to call him Chiang Kai-shek, okay, Chiang Kai-shek. More recently, sometimes you'll hear him referred to as Jiang Jieshi. Okay, so I'll put that in here just in case you see this. And by the way, I obviously do not speak Chinese, and so if any of you in here speak Chinese and I'm butchering these names, please, take pity on me, all right? I apologize if I am not saying it right. I'm just doing the best that I can. This is not my number one area that I know the most about in history. But anyhow, Jiang Jieshi, also known as Chiang Kai-shek, is the new leader of the Kuomintang after Sun Yat-sen dies. And just to give you a little background on him, Chiang Kai-shek, Jiang Jieshi, was the son of a kind of a middle-class merchant, so he's a relatively well-to-do sort of a guy. And many of Chiang Kai-shek's followers were bankers and business people who were part of what you might consider to be kind of a wealthy merchant bourgeoisie class in China. And many of these kinds of people who are bankers and businessmen and stuff like that, they don't want to see communism take over in China. Because, communists will take away private business and opportunities to make money and stuff like that, and they'll turn the whole state into a totalitarian regime. And Jiang Jieshi doesn't want to see that happen. So he and his followers are fearful of the communists' goal of creating a socialist economy that's modeled after the Soviet Union's command economy. And so Chiang Kai-shek had promised democracy and political rights to all people in China. And, basically, here's the thing. Even though Chiang Kai-shek advocates for democracy and political rights, under Chiang Kai-shek, technically, if we're being honest, his government became steadily less democratic and more corrupt. Chiang Kai-shek is not really, we have to get away from thinking about history as just good guys and bad guys, okay? Chiang Kai-shek was supported by the West, which would be easy to write a narrative about him that he was a good guy, okay? But Chiang Kai-shek is not really that good of a guy, okay? He's just a person. And a lot of peasants, the rural people who believe in communism and are joining the Communist Party of China, think that Chiang Kai-shek is really doing very little to improve their lives. And so many peasants end up throwing over their support to the Chinese Communist Party. And in order to enlist the support of more peasants, Mao Zedong divided land that the communists won among the local farmers. And so he was able to win over the support of the people by essentially giving them land. All right. Okay, moving on here. Here's, by the way, this is what Chiang Kai-shek looks like. Okay. And this you can't really see it because it's a black and white image, but this image up here, this little button on his hat up here, is a blue background button with a yellow sun on it. Okay, and or a white sun sometimes. And so this is the symbol of the Kuomintang up there, in case you can't see that. Okay. Moving on. Now, at first, when Chiang Kai-shek came to power with the Chinese Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party, he put aside his differences with the communists. He didn't like the communists. He didn't want to see communism take root in China, but he sets aside his differences. And together, Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces and the communists successfully fought against several of these warlords who had been, stirring up trouble across China. Soon afterward, though, he turned against the communists. And in April of 1927, nationalist troops and armed gangs moved into Shanghai, where the Communist Party was, and they killed many different communist leaders. They killed trade union members in the city streets, and similar killings took place in other cities. And so we have to understand that as Chiang Kai-shek is trying to establish the Kuomintang as the nationalist party to lead China towards democracy and stuff like that, he's using, terror tactics, much the same way that, for example, Lenin did or Stalin did, in order to get rid of any of his political adversaries. So the nationalists go on these kind of sprees, killing these communist folks, and they nearly completely wipe out the communist parties. Now, in 1928, Chiang Kai-shek became the leader of the new Nationalist Republic of China, which was led by the Kuomintang. Great Britain and the United States, because they supported Chiang Kai-shek over Mao Zedong and the communists, they both formally recognized the new government right away. And that's because after the communist revolution in Russia, Britain, the United States, and most of Europe went through this period of time in the 19-teens and 20s called the Red Scare. And there were two Red Scares. There was kind of a first Red Scare in the 20s and 30s, and then there was another Red Scare in the 50s and 60s during the Cold War. But they're afraid of communism spreading to other places. And so when Chiang Kai-shek and the Nationalist Party come to power in China, the U.S. and Britain are very quick to recognize the new government, and that's on this slide right here. All right. Now, on the other hand, the Soviet Union, which is by this point, of course, communist and led by this point, Joseph Stalin, after the slaughter of the communists in Shanghai, the Soviet Union refuses to recognize Chiang Kai-shek's government in China. And Chiang Kai-shek's treachery against his own people had long-term effects. The communists in China had deep-seated rage over this massacre, and it eventually erupted into a civil war between the nationalists and the communists that lasted in China until 1949, which is 4 years after the end of World War II. So, more civil war, all right? Because they're so outraged, by 1930, we see the nationalists and the communists fighting in this bloody civil war against one another. Mao Zedong and other communist leaders began establishing themselves in the hills of south central China. Mao Zedong referred to this tactic of taking his revolution to the countryside as swimming in the peasant sea. Remember, he's going to be trying to utilize the massive rural peasant population of China to gain political influence and pave the way for communism to take root in China. So Mao Zedong recruited peasants to join the Red Army of China, and then he trained them in guerrilla warfare tactics. And meanwhile, nationalists started attacking communists but failed to completely drive them out. And by 1933, after this war had been going on for several years already, Chiang Kai-shek gathered an army of at least 700,000 men, which is a massive army, and surrounded the communists' mountain stronghold. And this is the beginning of what becomes known as the Long March in 1933. Now, here's an image of the Chinese Nationalist Party. These are Kuomintang guys who are fighting against the Communist Party in the Chinese Civil War in the early 1930s. Okay, let's talk a bit about the Long March. Okay, so Chiang Kai-shek surrounded this stronghold with his army of 700,000 men. The Communist Party was completely outnumbered, and the leaders of the party realized that they were staring defeat right in the face. And in a daring move, 100,000 communist forces fled, still under the leadership of Mao Zedong, and they began a very hazardous 6,000-mile-long journey. So when we call this the Long March, that's no joke. It is truly a very long march. 6,000 miles, just as a comparison, let me see what I can pull up here. Okay, so a 6,000-mile march, okay, would be like traveling from Los Angeles to New York City, and then from New York City back to Los Angeles, and then probably back to about Las Vegas. That's how long of a march this was, okay? We are talking about an incredibly bold, daring, risky maneuver here, okay, that they do. And so the Long March, between 1934 and 1935, the communists kept just barely a step ahead of Chiang Kai-shek's forces, who began to hunt down the communists on this march. And what ends up happening is that thousands of people die from hunger, brutally cold weather, exposure to conditions in the mountains, battle wounds, all of these kinds of things. Finally, after a little over a year, Mao Zedong and about 7,000 or 8,000 communist survivors ended up basically settling in caves in northwestern China. And it was there that they start gaining more followers, okay? Meanwhile, the civil war between the nationalists and the communists, as that was continuing to rage onwards, things get worse. And Japan recognizes that there is a civil war going on in China at this time, and they end up invading China. And here I can show you this image of the Long March. Here is where they started off, okay, and you can see the path that they took here, and they march. And remember, all of these areas here are extremely mountainous and hazardous terrain, okay, very, very difficult. And so they're making their way all the way up here, and then they end up settling in some caves up here in north central China, and that's right about the time that Japan invades. And so this Chinese Civil War is going on. Japan takes advantage of this situation because they recognize that there's internal strife going on in China at this time. So in 1931, as Chinese people fought Chinese people, communists versus the Kuomintang, the Japanese watched the power struggles with rising interest, and Japanese forces took advantage of China's weakened situation, and they invaded Manchuria. And Manchuria is northeastern China. Sometimes it's called Manchukuo. And it's an industrialized province in the northeast part of China. And in 1937, the Japanese launched an all-out invasion of China. And this is where some really bad things happen. We'll talk more about this when we get into World War II. But this is what becomes known as the Second Sino-Japanese War. And what it is basically the Japanese, we talked about Japan before, and I had told you that Japan had already taken over Korea and made Korea essentially a slave colony. The Japanese were beyond brutal at this time. And as a result of that, they ended up really committing a lot of major crimes against humanity, just brutal atrocities against the Chinese people. Arnav, the Ip Man movie was made around that, right? When Japan, yes, Arnav, exactly. That is exactly it. And just to let you know, I mean, this should show you these historical events are very still much remembered by the Chinese people today. There is still, bitter resentment, particularly amongst the elderly segments of the population of China against the brutal atrocities that they faced at the hands of the Japanese when they invaded in 1936, 1937. So, and the Japanese, being an advanced military industrial power, really were, far superior in terms of their military than China's was. And China is going to have a really difficult time trying to keep the Japanese at bay and prevent them from completely taking over the entire country. Massive bombings of villages and cities killed thousands of Chinese people. There's a terrible event that we'll learn about in another unit called the Rape of Nanking that happens right about this time, where basically the Japanese military comes into this Chinese town of Nanking and ends up literally just raping and slaughtering about 30,000 people. And it's beyond atrocious, and eventually the people that conducted these terrible crimes were brought to justice, but it took a while. By 1938, just a year later after the Japanese began their invasions, they already held a major part of China, in particularly the northeast part of China, which is one of the more industrially developed areas where the ports are located. And so the Japanese threat, because they were so destructive, the Japanese threat essentially forces an uneasy truce between the Chinese Communist Party and the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party. So Chiang Kai-shek's forces and Mao Zedong's forces stop fighting one another after the Japanese invade, because they realize very quickly, if we continue fighting each other, that we're not going to have any China to fight over anymore, because the Japanese are going to completely take over the entire country. So the Civil War gradually came to a halt as the Kuomintang and the Communists temporarily united to fight on the same side against the Japanese. And the National Assembly of China further agreed to promote changes outlined in Sun Yat-sen's original 3 principles of the people: nationalism, democracy, and people's livelihood. And this is kind of the direction that China is going at this time as we enter into World War II, and our next unit really is going to be focusing more on this interwar period of the time span between 1919 and 1939, that 20-year time span where there's no wars going on, but it's set right between World War I and World War II. So this is the beginning of our interwar years unit, and hopefully, this gives you a pretty good idea of what's happening in China at this time. Just to give you a map here of what I was talking about, here is Manchukuo, here's Korea, which by this point had already been taken over by Japan going back to 1910. And so once the Civil War breaks out between the Chinese Communist Party and the Kuomintang, you can see the Japanese use kind of Korea as their launch point to invade Manchukuo up here, and then start steadily making their way further and further south. And in a very short period of time, the Japanese have essentially taken over this entire purple region here, just in about a year of invading China. So this is pretty much the lecture for the day. I covered everything that I wanted to. Now, before I sign off here, I just want to make sure, are there any questions that I can address for anyone at this time? Any questions about anything that I covered today? Is there homework? Yeah, I think I am going to put an assignment up right now. Yeah. Yeah, I'll put up an assignment right now. It'll be related to what we just talked about today. I'm not sure what it'll be yet, but I'm going to put it up in just a second. Any other questions, content-wise? Everybody clear? All right, well, if there are no questions, then just give me a couple of minutes here and I will put up an assignment for you. Are there retakes for the exam? Michaela, no, there are not retakes for the exam. The exam is a one-time deal only. I can't log into Canvas. Is Caps Lock on? Go to MyCNUSD first. Sign into MyCNUSD on the Corona Norco website first, and then go to Digital Classrooms and try opening it that way. All right, folks. If there are no more questions. If you can't log into Canvas, that's going to be a thing. You're going to have to call up, your password may have expired. You may need to reset your password, or if you're having further issues after that, you may need to call up IT and have them walk you through how to log on to it. Okay. All right. Well, so long as there are no other questions, that is it for me today. In terms of the lecture, please make sure to, go on to Canvas. I'll make the assignment due for Tuesday, so you'll have time to get it done. Just don't forget to do it. But we will meet back tomorrow, where we will continue to talk about the interwar years and talk about what happens after World War I and the Treaty of Versailles and all of those sorts of things. So thanks so much for tuning in today. And have a wonderful rest of your Thursday. Take care, kids.